Welcome to Light the Clock. In this season, we're exploring the fascinating relationship between circadian rhythms, light exposure, and modern society. Today's episode is all about how the place where we live, whether that's a big city or a quiet rural village, shapes our exposure to light, our internal clocks, and ultimately our health. To get to the heart of this topic, I started where many of us would, with a personal conversation. And so I called up my sister, Annie, who lives in the big city of London. Hi, Annie. How are you doing?
Hey, Caro. I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. So I'm calling because I'm recording a podcast episode next week. And we're going to talk about circadian rhythms in cities and in the countryside, so like in rural areas. And I thought I would get your input on like what are interesting questions that I can ask in the episode, because you live in the big city of London. So I know that this is a topic that is close to your heart and very relevant for you. So yeah, like if you think about like circadian rhythms and sleep, what are questions that you would like to get answered in terms of like your context, so like living in a big city compared to living in the countryside?
Yeah, very interesting question, I think. Mainly, I think it's two things that impact my circadian rhythm. The first one is the noise of the city. London is a very noisy city, as you can imagine. I personally live in a place where they're building lots of new buildings. So I'm constantly exposed to noise. And the second factor I would say is like indoor time. So unfortunately, in London, also because of the weather, it's very hard to get outdoor time, especially in the winter, which is so long. So yeah, I would be interested to know more about how, these two things, are influencing my circadian rhythms.
Yeah, cool. Would you say that your light exposure would be different if you were to live in like a smaller city or more like a countryside area?
100%. I don't have any research to back this, but I would 100% say yes to this. Yes.
So to provide some science and scientific answers to these topics and questions, I reached out to our expert guest, Luísa Klaus Pilz, who's done great work in studying circadian rhythms and light exposure in communities across different levels of urbanization and access to electricity. Luísa, welcome to Light the Clock. I thought to start, it would be great if you could give us a little introduction. So if you could tell us where you're based, where you are in your scientific journey, and what you research.
Sure. Thank you, Caroline. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm currently a junior professor for circadian medicine at Charité Universitätsmedizin Berlin. But I've also did most of my training in Brazil. And before that, I was working there in Porto Alegre. And I understand that some of the studies we will discuss, they were ran when I was there.
Yeah, great. And before we get to these studies, I think it would be great if we could just briefly talk about why we're interested in comparing the circadian rhythms of people who are city dwellers, so people who live in more urban areas, to those of people who live in more rural areas. Why is this interesting to us, and why should we care about these differences?
Yeah, so I think for us chronobiologists, one of the most interesting contrast between urban and rural areas is how light exposure generally varies across these different areas. And what I always find, when I stop to think about it, what I always find interesting is how recent, for example, access to artificial light is. So it became widespread worldwide thanks to electricity in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And of course, it didn't happen all at once everywhere. It started in big cities, then it gradually reached rural areas. And what is relevant here, of course, is that artificial light enable us to work late in bright offices, for example, in the evening, drive down highways at night and read news at night on our smartphones or watch TV shows at night. And therefore, we extend our days, right? But in general, people are also quite less exposed to natural light during the day in these urbanized areas and spend their days, for example, in offices or in schools. And this can be quite different in rural workers. And that's something that we also saw in our studies. And maybe why do we chronobiologists care about all of this is because light, it profoundly influences our physiology, our behavior. Maybe for us as individuals, it's quite obvious that it enables vision. But for us chronobiologists, light is very interesting because it's considered the most important signal to our so-called internal clock, or this timing system that we have, which basically, in very simple words, it organizes what happens when in our body. And light is what helps this timing system to keep in sync with the environment, with the external time. That's why we call it the Zeitgeber, which is a German word that means time giver.
Right. So basically studying communities that have different levels of urbanization and also different levels of exposure or history with artificial light, so with electric light, enables us to kind of characterize how these different lighting histories and lighting systems influence potentially circadian rhythms, right?
Exactly. So we investigated how these different histories of access to electricity were associated with patterns in sleep. And by that, I mean when people sleep, for how long they sleep. And that's what studies that generally looked at what we call pre-industrial communities. That's what they investigate. They try to see how sleep is different when you don't have access to electricity or artificial lighting, which we know that changed our lifestyles that much.
Right. So kind of leading into the research that you did, what do we know exactly about how sleep patterns like sleep timing different in different communities that have different levels of urbanization? And maybe you can tell us also how you investigated this question.
So generally our studies and studies of other researchers that compared communities with and without access to electricity shows that sleep is generally earlier in these communities without access to electricity. And in some cases, it showed that sleep was shorter in communities that have access to electricity. This is not a consensus. So in some studies, sleep duration was not significantly different. And in some studies, maybe even not with a comparison group, but there was still some suggestion as to sleep duration being shorter in the group without electricity access. What is interesting or what is important to consider here is that, of course, sleep is quite a plastic behavioral trait, I would say. And there's so many other things that also affect it. And we know that sleep is not only influenced by this circadian process, there is also this homeostatic process that influences how much we sleep, for example. So that's another thing to consider. And these communities that have been studied, they live in so many different conditions. So we studied, for example, agricultural communities, but you also have studies investigating hunter-gatherers, for example. And this, of course, they may also influence sleep and how much one person sleeps.
Right. So basically, in terms of sleep timing, there is more consensus that communities that live in more rural settings without artificial light at all or with less artificial light, they sleep earlier. But in terms of sleep duration, it seems like depending on the community investigated, it's not really clear if there is a shorter or a longer duration depending on the access to electric light.
Exactly. So sleep duration is less of a consensus.
I see. And coming back to the sleep timing that you mentioned, so do we know if there is an earlier sleep timing in these communities that do not have access to electric light because of exactly the fact that they don't have access to electric light and they have more access or they're more exposed to during the day to daylight?
Yeah, it's sometimes difficult to disentangle because you have both these aspects in communities without electricity. So, for example, the community we studied that had no access to electricity indeed had more light exposure during the day as compared to some other rural communities, and less exposure in the evening. So it is difficult to disentangle. And we see, for example, having a high light exposure during the day as compared to in the evening associating with earlier time. So we do see that a stronger signal, meaning a bright day and a dark night, it associates with earlier timing in our sample, for example.
I see. And can you tell us a bit more about these communities that you studied? You were in Brazil, right?
Exactly, yeah. So we studied communities that are spread across Brazil and that have similar sociocultural characteristics. These are the Quilombola communities. Quilombos is how we call the communities. And the Quilombos, they were originally settlements that were founded in isolated places by enslaved people who fled from plantations where they were forced to work. But more recently, Quilombola communities are defined as communities that identify themselves as Quilombolas and have African ancestry related to a history of resistance to historical oppression. What is interesting maybe for us, the reason why we were interested in investigating them is that you have the similar sociocultural characteristics in different communities, which means that we could find communities that were similar in that way. But then you had these different sort of histories of access to electricity. So it means that we could have a sort of a control. We could compare this community without access to electricity to communities that already have access to electricity and at least have some degree of similarity in terms of sociocultural characteristics.
Right. And how did you investigate circadian rhythms in these communities? Like, what was your way of quantifying for example, the sleep timing of these communities?
Yeah, so we used two different instruments, or we did it in two different ways. One was with questionnaires, so we asked them about their sleep timing. And the other one was actigraphy. And actimeters are these devices that they are similar to wristwatches. They are worn on the wrist, and based on movement, we can estimate when one is sleeping. So we used both approaches, and both approaches were actually quite similar. So that's one of the interesting things about doing it both ways, is that you can see if, regardless of how you measure, you find similar results, and if they are to some degree associated. And that we could see in our study. So both with questionnaires and with actigraphy, we could see generally earlier sleep patterns in the community without electricity when we compare them to communities that already had access to electricity, even if it's still rural, for example. And we saw that with actigraphy data. We saw that with questionnaires data as well. So when people reported us when they went to sleep, when they woke up, and so on.
I see. And just to get an idea, when you say like communities that had already access to electricity, how long had they had this access to electricity for?
Yeah, so this is an interesting, I think, aspect of our study, because we could reach communities that had these varied and different histories of access to electricity. So we had, for example, a community where the participants reported to us that they had recently gotten access to electricity like 2 years ago, and then some communities that reported having it for already 20 years or even longer. So that was also interesting, and we report it in our studies, for example. But maybe anecdotally, one of the things that I noticed when I was there is, for example, that the community that had recently gotten access to electricity, perhaps they would use it in a different way. So, of course, one of the things we always have to consider is not only having access to it, but how it is embedded in culture, how people will take advantage of it, use it, and that was interesting. I mean, we didn't quantify that, so I cannot say anything in terms of numbers, but one observation I would say I made was that the way people use electricity and artificial lighting, it also varies, of course, as we also see it in the city, right?
Yeah, of course. You said that you found earlier sleep timing in the communities that had no access to electricity compared to those who had access. already to electricity. Did you see kind of like a gradual difference, if that makes sense? Because you said you have like some communities that had only access from 2 years and then others from 20 years. So did you see like kind of a difference also between the communities that already had access, but from different lengths of time?
Yeah, so that we also to some degree saw, for example, this community that had recently gotten access, this one that had access for 2 years only, it was very similar to the community without access to electricity. And then other rural communities that already had it for longer would sleep earlier. And some of them, not all of them, would sleep significantly shorter. So to some degree, I also saw what the literature shows, that some communities do sleep longer if we compare to the control with access to electricity already. So some communities with no electricity sleep longer, some maybe do not. So we sort of saw that in the rural communities with access to electricity. So when we compared sleep duration, some of them did sleep shorter, while others did not, which was also interesting. We haven't published comparisons in sleep timings between the rural community without electricity, rural community with electricity, and urban communities yet. But we recently also, or more recently, collected data from urban communities, urban Quilombola communities. And when we look at these data, we see then even later sleep timings than the rural community, for example, when we compare them.
Right. Okay, interesting. And I believe you also didn't just look at sleep timing and sleep duration, but also at other health differences and I think metabolic health in these different communities. So like differences are linked to circadian rhythms as well.
Yeah, so we looked at BMI, thinking a bit of metabolic health, as you mentioned. Of course, it's an indicator that has its problems, but it's still it's interesting, and we could assess it in our field of work. And when we
sorry, just to clarify, BMI is body mass index, right?
Exactly, body mass index, and from that we can, for example, derive information on whether someone meets criterion for being classified as overweight or having obesity. And we saw, for example, in our sample, a higher rate of obesity among individuals in the urban community as compared to those in the non-electricity rural community. But here what I would say is also that it's very important to highlight that our sample size was small, hence generalizability is limited. And some recent studies, for example, that compare these communities may have different results. And historically, rural areas had lower BMI, and urbanization has been linked to increased overweight and obesity levels, possibly because of infrastructure such as roads and electricity that facilitate food trade. But for example, some recent findings suggest that in recent years, likely due to changes, for example, improved access, cheap processed food, lifestyle changes, some rural areas are now seeing a significant and fast increase in overweight and obesity rates. So it's important to highlight that our sample has the characteristics it has, and it doesn't necessarily reflect every rural and urban population or community. But what I think is very interesting in our study is that we also looked at these metrics that we derive from actigraphy. And we saw, for example, that intradaily variability, so a more fragmented rest activity rhythm, it associates with both overweight and obesity. So when we compare people who are overweight or who are obese, what we saw was that these people had a higher intradaily variability of their rest activity rhythms and of their light exposure, which speaks for more fragmented rhythms. And we also saw a lower light exposure, especially in during the part of the day where people were more exposed to light, right? During this period, the people who had obesity, they had lower values, suggesting that they are less exposed to light during the day, for example. That I find interesting, and that is something that studies with larger sample sizes also saw, and this association between circadian disruption and metabolic outcomes is also showing in different studies. And for example, there are already meta-analyses suggesting associations of other interesting proxy for circadian disruption, which is a social jet lag. So there is a meta-analysis showing, or there are meta-analysis showing associations of social jet lag with obesity. So what I find very interesting here, and the reason why we looked at this data this way, is that we wanted to see if there is an association of circadian disruption with overweight and obesity.
Right. And in your case, you basically then saw like, people who are exposed to less light during the day tend to be more obese or be more overweight. And that's like higher BMI, right?
Exactly.
But also who have more like fragmented rhythms. So like fragmented sleep and wake rhythm, they also tend to have higher BMI.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's what we saw.
And so I'm just wondering, I think in this research, there's also some challenges in understanding like differences across communities in terms of circadian rhythms. Because one thing that kind of comes to my mind is that for communities that are rural, compared to communities that are urban, the rural communities also tend to have jobs that are associated, for example, with agriculture or farming. And so these are jobs that demand or require early wake-up times. And so I guess my question is like, do we know if these communities wake up earlier compared to urban communities just because of their occupation?
That's a very interesting question. One of the things that I believe speaks for not being, at least not only that, is that, for example, in the non-electricity community that we investigated, the high majority said they don't use alarm clocks to wake up. As compared to other communities that are rural and have electricity, we saw an increase in the rate of people who would say, we use alarm clocks to wake up. But of course, in some rural communities, I also heard that some people would, for example, wake up early because they had to feed the animals, for example. So I think what is important to consider here is that their work is generally associated with light exposure, right? So while they're working, they're generally exposed to natural light and high intensity light as compared to, so when we go to work, and us, I mean, we in urbanized areas. So when I go to work, I'm going to a closed environment. And while I do try to sit close to my window and get some sunlight in, my light exposure is very different than someone who's working outside. So if they are working in the morning, they're exposed to light, probably of a high intensity in the morning, that would advance their clock as well. So while it's of course a bit difficult sometimes to disentangle what influences in field studies, considering this scenario that I just commented on, I think we have evidence, let's say, or we can say that it's highly likely that it's because of their light exposure especially in the case of the non-electricity community as compared to a urban community, for example, that their sleep is earlier because of their light exposure patterns.
Okay. And I guess it goes the other way around for the urban communities against the rural communities, right? So it's also hard to know if it's like the light exposure that's kind of poor in or poorer in urban communities, and that kind of influences circadian rhythms, or it could also be like the behaviors that these people have. So people also do more like social activities in the evenings. If I think about people living in cities, there are more things going on in the evening that might also impact your circadian rhythms, right?
Exactly. And the other thing is that, yes, it can be the case, but it can also be that it is mediated by light. That's what maybe I was trying to convey before. So I have to work earlier, hence I wake up earlier, hence I get more light, hence my rhythms advance, for example. And in field studies, it's sometimes, as I said, difficult to disentangle some of these aspects. But as you said, it's also true that when you stay up late, and if you are in a social activity, and if you do that often, you have generally a light, dark cycle in which you have more exposure to light in the evening or at night. So yes, both happen at the same time.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that go together and eventually lead to different circadian rhythms.
Exactly, yeah.
And one thing that I find particularly interesting is to think about kind of how adaptation from an urban environment to a rural environment would work for a person, or the other way around. So like if we take someone, say, from like a big city and then suddenly they have to go and live in a rural environment for some time, or they have to go camping for some time.
That's a very good question. And there is actually a group that investigated that. That's the group of Professor Kenneth Wright in the so-called camping studies. And they did exactly that. So they studied the same subjects in one condition where they were in the city, and then the other condition was when they went camping. And what is interesting here is that then you can compare the same people in two different scenarios, which is something that we cannot do with the other studies that we were discussing, right? So we investigate one community that lives without electricity versus one that lives with it, or in rural areas versus urban areas, but it's different people. So here the great advantage is that you're comparing the same individuals. And what they saw is that when people went camping, they had a higher light exposure to sunlight during the day. They also had decreased light exposure after sunset, and their rhythms were advanced.
Right. And when you say advanced rhythms, what does that mean exactly?
So there's sleep timing, but also they measured melatonin. And melatonin also advanced. And what is also interesting is that we have, of course, these individual differences that we observe in populations, which is we have people who are early types, people who are late types, people who are intermediate types, and the so-called chronotypes. And what they saw is that people who were later chronotypes, they showed larger circadian advances, and they were more similar to earlier chronotypes when they were camping.
I see. So basically the trend that they saw in the participants was that when they were moved to the camping environment, so the rural setting, let's say, their sleep timing was earlier compared to when they were living in the urban setting.
Exactly. Yeah.
I see. Do you know if like the opposite experiment has also been done? I guess this would be a little hard because you would have to find someone who's been camping their whole life.
Yes, exactly.
And then move them to a city, right?
Yeah, so one way of doing that is following these communities that we have accessed. And by we, I mean we in Porto Alegre as a research group, but also other research groups that investigated these pre-industrial communities and follow them when they do get access to electricity. So that would be a way of seeing if that also happens. And I guess it would be quite interesting because then we have people who indeed are generally living in this condition of having no access to electricity or artificial light. And then they have this change in access and eventually in lifestyles, and following this transition would be very interesting.
Yeah, that would be super, super interesting. I think so too. And just to kind of wrap up the episode, I was wondering if you can give us like a little, like your personal perspective of like interesting research questions that you think would be nice to explore when talking about differences in circadian rhythms between communities that are urban and communities that are more rural.
So one of the interesting questions is that I can think of is very much related to the last topic we just discussed, which is sort of following these communities and seeing how their sleep actually change once they have access to electricity, how their lifestyles change, and how this may be different across age groups or groups that are different depending on, for example, other social-cultural aspects. Another thing that I would find interesting is to, in the future, and employ technologies that maybe allow for us to assess sleep and circadian rhythms in other ways. There are current or other new devices that allow for us to assess some aspects that before we couldn't, with new wearable technology, for example, and so on. So I think maybe in future, some of these things could be addressed and investigated more deeply, taking advantage of new technologies that are coming. And finally, on a more personal note, maybe what one feeling I had when discussing or when interviewing our participants is that sometimes the sort of epistemic terms we use, they were developed in and for urban industrialized settings. And I think it would be very interesting to investigate these aspects and understand them a bit more. So how these terms that we use, they may actually carry some subjective assumptions or some assumptions that are related to this context, urban, industrialized, and so on, and how the way we ask and the terms we use may not fully capture sleep patterns in this other setting. That's a bit more philosophical, but I would be also interested in seeing that happening.
I think it's really interesting that you noticed this. Yeah, did you notice this when you were administering the questionnaire for the chronotype?
Yeah, exactly. Not necessarily the chronotype one, but we had a set of questionnaires that we would ask to the participants, and we didn't quantify that or anything. But sometimes when asking questions, some of the questions would require a bit of explaining, for example. So I think it would be interesting to investigate that a bit further. So how these terms carry some of the characteristics or some of the assumptions that we have based on how we sleep in urban areas or areas where we do have access to electricity, for example.
Yeah, definitely. Very interesting. And yeah, I think a great note to end on, to make research a little bit more less biased, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing with us everything that you know and also the details of the studies that you carried out. Very, very cool work. Thank you, Luísa.
Thank you, Carolina. It was a pleasure to be here.
That's it for this episode of Light O'Clock. Don't forget to follow us, share this episode, check the show notes for relevant links and resources, and join us next time as we keep chasing the science behind light, whether it's peeking through skyscrapers or rising over open fields. Catch you next time. You have been listening to Light O'Clock. This podcast is produced by me, Caro Guidolin. The podcast team includes many of my amazingly supportive colleagues and lab members. Manuel Spitzchen does the scientific fact-checking, and music, mix, and sound design are done by Ingo Bednarek. Show notes and additional resources are created by Maidel Fernandez Alonso and myself. Our social media team includes Lucien Bickerstaff, Nilufar Tabande, and Zara Alkaf. And Anna Magdalena Billa is our test listener. Light O'Clock is a podcast produced by the Translational Sensory and Circadian Neuroscience Unit, and we are supported by the Circadian Mental Health Network, the Viscom Prize from the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Psychologie and the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Psychophysiologie und ihre Anwendung, the Max Planck Society and the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics, and the Technical University of Munich.